Welcome to Grim Fiction, where darkness meets tranquility. Here, we weave haunting tales set to the soothing sound of rain, perfect for those who crave a touch of the eerie to drift off to sleep. Every night, immerse yourself in new stories that blend the mysterious with the calming, transforming your nights into a journey through the shadows. Subscribe now and let the rain carry you into a world of chilling tales posted daily just for you. The Turner family arrived at their new home on a crisp autumn afternoon, their car tires crunching along the gravel driveway. The house loomed ahead, its dark silhouette cutting against the orange glow of the setting sun. The Victorian-style mansion was weathered but elegant, with intricate wooden trim and towering, narrow windows that seemed to watch their every move. "This place is huge!" Max, the eldest of the two siblings, exclaimed as he stepped out of the car. At 14, he tried to maintain an air of teenage indifference, but even he couldn't hide his amazement. Ellie, his 10-year-old sister, clutched her stuffed rabbit as she stared at the house. "It looks sad," she murmured. "Nonsense, Ellie. It's beautiful," their mother Sarah said as she carried a box toward the front steps. "It just needs a little love." Their father, David, unlocked the front door and pushed it open with a groan of old hinges. "Well, let's give it some," he said, flipping a switch. A single flickering chandelier illuminated the grand entryway, revealing a sweeping staircase, faded wallpaper, and the unmistakable smell of dust and age. The family spent the rest of the evening unpacking boxes and exploring the house. Max found a game room tucked in a corner of the first floor, complete with a dusty billiard table and shelves of old books. Ellie, meanwhile, wandered upstairs. She was drawn to the end of the hallway, where a single door stood apart from the others. Unlike the other rooms, this one had no nameplate or visible purpose. The doorknob was cold and didn't budge when she turned it. "Dad?" Ellie called downstairs. "There's a door up here that's locked." "Probably just a closet," David replied distractedly as he balanced a box in one hand. "We'll figure it out later." Ellie lingered by the door, her fingers brushing the ornate carvings on the wood. She felt a strange pull, as if the door were inviting her closer. A shiver ran down her spine, but she couldn't look away. "Ellie, come help me with these," her mom called from another room, breaking the spell. Ellie hesitated before running down the hall. That night, after the house had quieted and everyone had gone to bed, Ellie woke to the sound of faint tapping. She sat up in her room, her heart pounding. The sound wasn't coming from her window or her walls. It was coming from the hallway. Curious and a little scared, she slipped out of bed and padded toward the locked door. The hallway was cold, the air heavy with stillness. As she approached, the tapping stopped. She stared at the door, half expecting it to open on its own. When nothing happened, Ellie reached out, her small hand trembling, and touched the doorknob again. This time it was warm. Behind her, the floor creaked. She spun around, but there was nothing there, just the dim, flickering light from the hallway bulb. She backed away from the door, her breath quickening, and hurried back to her room, diving under the covers. Ellie didn't sleep for the rest of the night, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching her, and that it was still waiting behind that door. The next morning dawned cold and gray, casting long shadows across the Turner family's new home. Ellie was unusually quiet at breakfast, poking at her cereal, while Max teased her about still carrying her stuffed rabbit everywhere. "Maybe you should let Mr. Fluffy move into one of the other rooms. This place has plenty of space for creepy old toys," Max joked, gesturing dramatically around the dining room. Ellie scowled. "He's not creepy." "All right, you two," their father interrupted. "Today's a big day. We've got a lot of unpacking to do. Let's focus." Despite the distraction of chores, Ellie couldn't stop thinking about the locked door. There was something about it, something that seemed to call to her, even in the daylight. After lunch, while the rest of the family worked downstairs, Ellie ventured into the attic. Her mom had asked her to gather any boxes that might still be stored up there. The attic was a dark and dusty space, filled with forgotten furniture and cobweb-draped trunks. Ellie wrinkled her nose at the musty smell and stepped carefully, avoiding loose planks and creaking boards. As she rummaged through a box of old photo frames, something shiny caught her eye. It was a small, ornate key lying atop a folded lace handkerchief in a tarnished jewelry box. The key was intricate, its bow carved with swirling designs that reminded her of vines or smoke. Ellie picked it up, her fingers tingling as she turned it over in her hands. "Where do you belong?" she whispered. Ellie didn't have to wonder for long. Later that afternoon, while her mom was sorting linens in one of the bedrooms, Ellie slipped away. She tiptoed down the hall toward the locked door. Her heart pounded as she held the key up to the lock, hesitating. "Ellie!" Max's voice startled her, and she jumped, nearly dropping the key. She turned to see her brother leaning against the wall, arms crossed. "What are you doing?" he asked, suspicious. "Nothing," Ellie said too quickly, hiding the key behind her back. Max narrowed his eyes. "You've been acting weird ever since we moved here. What's up with that door?" "It's just a door," Ellie muttered, but Max wasn't convinced. "Let me see," he said, stepping forward. Ellie sighed and reluctantly held out the key. Max took it and studied the design. "Where'd you find this?" "The attic," Ellie said. "It's probably for this door. Don't you want to see what's inside?" "No way." Max handed the key back to her. "If it's locked, there's probably a reason. Mom and Dad won't be happy if you mess with it." Ellie frowned, but said nothing as Max walked away. Once he was out of sight, she turned back to the door, gripping the key tightly. Her curiosity was stronger than her fear or her brother's warnings. That night, Ellie waited until everyone was asleep before sneaking back to the hallway. The house was silent, the only sound the creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. She reached the door and fit the key into the lock. With a soft click, the lock released and the door creaked open. The room beyond was small and empty, its walls covered in faded, peeling wallpaper. Dust motes floated in the air, illuminated by the dim light from the hallway. The only furniture was a single wooden chair in the center of the room and an oval-shaped mirror hanging on the far wall. Ellie stepped inside, her bare feet cold against the floor. The air in the room felt heavy, almost alive, as if it were holding its breath. She approached the mirror, which was framed in tarnished silver. Its surface was dusty, but as she reached out to wipe it clean, she hesitated. Her reflection stared back at her, its features slightly blurred. But something was off. As she tilted her head, her reflection didn't move at the same time. It was subtle, just a fraction of a second too slow, but enough to make Ellie's heart race. And then it smiled. Ellie stumbled back, her breath caught in her throat. Her reflection stood still for a moment, its grin wide and unnatural, before its lips moved as if speaking. No sound came out, but Ellie felt as though the room had whispered her name. Terrified, she bolted from the room, slamming the door shut behind her. She clutched the key tightly in her hand, her heart pounding as she ran back to her room and buried herself under her blankets. The mirror's grin was burned into her mind, and even as she squeezed her eyes shut, she could still feel it watching her. The morning sunlight streaming through her window did little to calm Ellie's nerves. She sat on her bed, the ornate key still clutched in her hand. Her thoughts raced as she replayed the events of the previous night. Had she imagined it? Was the strange grin in the mirror just a trick of the light, or something more sinister? "Ellie, breakfast," her mom called from downstairs. Ellie stuffed the key into her pocket and made her way to the dining room. Her family was already seated, their chatter filling the air. Max glanced up at her and smirked. "You look like you saw a ghost," he teased. "What's up?" "Nothing," Ellie said quickly, avoiding his gaze. She poked at her scrambled eggs, her appetite gone. Max leaned closer. "You went back to that door, didn't you?" Ellie froze. "No," she lied, but the flush in her cheeks gave her away. Max raised an eyebrow, but didn't push further. That afternoon, while her parents busied themselves unpacking and Max buried his face in a video game, Ellie found herself drawn back to the door. She tried to resist, but the pull was too strong, like an invisible thread tugging at her curiosity. This time, when she stepped inside the small room, the mirror was waiting. Its surface gleamed faintly, as if polished overnight. Ellie approached cautiously, her reflection staring back with wide eyes. She hesitated, then whispered, "Hello?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then, her reflection blinked too slowly, as if catching up to her movement. Ellie's stomach tightened as she watched it tilt its head in a way she hadn't. Its lips moved silently, forming words she couldn't hear. "What do you want?" Ellie stammered. The air in the room shifted, growing colder. Suddenly a soft, childlike voice echoed around her. Though it didn't seem to come from the mirror, it was faint, almost like a breeze carrying words. "Play with me." Ellie's breath caught in her throat. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. The reflection's smile returned, wide and unnatural. The voice came again, clearer this time. "My name is Clara. I've been waiting for you." Ellie backed away, her legs shaking. I don't want to play. I have to go." The reflection's smile faltered. For a split second, Ellie thought she saw something behind it, a shadowy figure moving in the mirror's depths. She turned and bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind her. That evening, Max found her sitting in her room, hugging her stuffed rabbit tightly. "All right, what's going on?" he asked, sitting on the edge of her bed. "You've been acting super weird." Ellie hesitated. If she told Max what she'd seen, he'd probably just tease her, or worse, tell their parents. But the memory of the mirror's grin haunted her, and she couldn't keep it to herself anymore. "There's something in the mirror," she said quietly. Max frowned. "What are you talking about?" "In the locked room," Ellie explained. "There's a mirror and there's someone in it. She says her name is Clara." Max stared at her for a long moment before scoffing. "You're just trying to scare me." "I'm not," Ellie insisted. "I saw her. She talks to me. She wants me to play with her." "Okay, that's it," Max said, standing up. "You've been spending too much time up there. Let's go check it out, and I'll prove it's just a regular old mirror." "No!" Ellie grabbed his arm, her voice desperate. "Don't go in there. It's not safe." Max hesitated. His sister's fear was so genuine, so raw, that it made him second-guess himself. "Fine," he said, "but if this is some dumb prank, you owe me big time." That night, Max waited until the house was silent. Despite Ellie's protests, he couldn't let her story go. If she really believed there was something in the room, he had to see it for himself. Armed with a flashlight, Max crept down the hallway and unlocked the door with the key Ellie had left on her nightstand. The room was just as Ellie had described, small, dusty, and dominated by the oval mirror on the far wall. Max stepped inside, shining his flashlight across the room. The beam reflected sharply off the mirror's surface, casting eerie shadows on the walls. He moved closer, peering at his reflection. Everything seemed normal. "Clara?" he whispered mockingly, his voice low. "Are you there?" The room remained silent. Max smirked, shaking his head. "Ellie, you're losing it," he muttered under his breath. But as he turned to leave, he froze. His flashlight flickered, the beam dimming until the room was bathed in near darkness. Max turned back toward the mirror, and his blood ran cold. His reflection wasn't moving. It stood still, its face frozen in a wide grin. Max stumbled backward, his heart pounding. The flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, he thought he saw something behind his reflection. A pale, thin face with hollow eyes peering out from the shadows. The voice came then, soft and sing-song, "Stay with me." Max didn't hesitate. He bolted from the room, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the hallway as he leaned against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. From the other side of the door, the faint sound of laughter echoed, sending chills down his spine. The next morning, the Turner household was on edge. Ellie avoided the locked room entirely, refusing to even glance down the hallway. Max sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at his cereal. He couldn't shake the memory of his frozen reflection, the wide grin, and the pale face in the mirror. "You're unusually quiet," Sarah remarked, eyeing him over her coffee. "What's going on?" "Nothing," Max replied quickly, shoving a spoonful of cereal into his mouth. He wasn't ready to explain what had happened. Not yet. Meanwhile, Ellie couldn't stay silent any longer. She tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mom, do you know anything about this house? Like who lived here before us?" Sarah smiled gently. "You're not scared of the old place, are you, sweetheart? It's just a house." "No," Ellie lied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just curious." Her mother ruffled her hair. "I'll ask around if it makes you feel better, but I'm sure there's nothing to worry about." That afternoon, Sarah took a trip to the local hardware store for supplies, using the opportunity to chat with the clerk. The man, a wiry older gentleman named Mr. Harrington, perked up when she mentioned their house. "Oh, the old Blackwood place, huh?" he said, his voice lowering as if sharing a secret. "You've got yourselves a piece of history there." Sarah laughed nervously. "What kind of history?" "Well," Harrington began, leaning on the counter, "the place has a bit of a reputation. Rumor is, the original family that lived there back in the 1920s had a daughter, Clara Blackwood. Little girl went missing, vanished without a trace." Sarah stiffened. "Missing? What happened?" "No one knows," Harrington said, his tone grave. "The parents swore she was last seen playing in a small upstairs room, the one with the mirror. Police searched everywhere but found nothing. Some say she ran away. Others think the house had something to do with it." "That's ridiculous," Sarah said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Maybe so," Harrington shrugged, "but after the Blackwoods moved out, no family stayed long. Folks talk about strange noises, odd happenings. Some even claim they've seen her, Clara, that is, looking out from the upstairs windows." Sarah returned home, her cheerful facade noticeably dimmed. She didn't share what she'd learned with her children, deciding it was best not to fuel their fears. But Ellie noticed her mother's tense smile and the way her eyes flicked toward the hallway. "Did you find out anything?" Ellie asked when her mother passed by her room. "Nothing important," Sarah said, brushing the question off. "Now go play, honey. Everything's fine." But Ellie knew her mother was lying. Later that evening, Max cornered Ellie in her room. He was pale, his eyes darting nervously toward the hallway. "We need to talk," he said in a hushed voice, "about the mirror." Ellie looked up at him, her face pale. "You saw her, didn't you?" Max hesitated, then nodded. "There's something wrong with that room, Ellie. I don't know what it is, but it's not normal. I saw something in the mirror last night. It wasn't me. It smiled at me." Ellie shivered. "She smiled at me too. She said her name is Clara." Max's eyes widened. "Clara? How do you know that?" "She told me," Ellie whispered. "She wants to play." The siblings sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the revelation pressing down on them. Finally, Max said, "We need to figure out what's going on. There has to be a reason she's still here." Ellie nodded reluctantly, though the thought of returning to the room filled her with dread. "What if Mom and Dad don't believe us?" "They don't have to know," Max said firmly. "We'll figure this out ourselves." The following day, the siblings decided to explore the house's history. They rode their bikes into town and visited the local library, combing through dusty records and old newspaper clippings. It wasn't long before they found an article from 1928 detailing the disappearance of Clara Blackwood. The grainy photograph of the young girl sent chills through Ellie's spine. Clara had wide, innocent eyes and long, dark hair that framed her delicate face. The article described her as a cheerful child with a love for stories and games, but it also mentioned her peculiar habit of talking to her own reflection. "She believed the mirror was alive," Ellie read aloud, her voice trembling. "She told her parents it was her friend." Max leaned over her shoulder, pointing to another passage. "Look at this. Her parents reported hearing Clara's voice late at night, even when she was asleep. Some neighbors claimed to see strange lights in the upstairs room." "It's her," Ellie whispered. "She's still here." As they packed up their findings and headed home, Ellie felt a growing sense of unease. If Clara was trapped in the mirror, why had she stayed all these years? And why was she so eager to play? Neither Max nor Ellie had the answer, but one thing was certain. Whatever had happened to Clara, the mystery was far from over, and it was waiting for them back in the forgotten room. Ellie couldn't stay away from the room. Despite the growing fear gnawing at her, something about it pulled her in, like a moth to a flame. She began sneaking in whenever she could, always closing the door quietly behind her. Inside, the air was thick and still, the mirror gleaming in the dim light. "Clara," Ellie whispered one afternoon, her voice trembling. The reflection rippled as if disturbed by an invisible force. Slowly the surface cleared, and Clara's image appeared. Her pale face and hollow eyes stared back at Ellie, but this time her expression was softer, almost pleading. "You came back," Clara said, her voice faint but clear. Ellie swallowed hard. "Why are you here?" Clara tilted her head, her long dark hair falling over her shoulder. "This is my home. I've always been here. Don't you want to play?" "I don't know," Ellie replied. Her hands tightened around her stuffed rabbit. "What kind of games do you play?" Clara's reflection leaned closer, her lips curling into a gentle smile. "Fun ones. I can show you things no one else can. Don't you want to see?" Ellie hesitated, a chill running through her. "See what?" The mirror rippled again, and suddenly Ellie wasn't looking at the small room anymore. Instead, she saw herself standing in a lush garden, surrounded by vibrant flowers and glowing butterflies. The sky above was an endless pink and gold sunset, and the air smelled of honey and lavender. It was beautiful, unreal. "Isn't it wonderful?" Clara asked, her voice laced with excitement. "We can stay here forever." Ellie reached out to touch the glass, her fingers brushing the surface. The image flickered, and for a brief moment the garden disappeared, replaced by a dark, shadowy void. Clara's face emerged in the darkness, her smile sharper now, her eyes glittering with something Ellie couldn't name. Ellie yanked her hand back. I have to go." "Wait," Clara called, her voice more desperate. "Don't leave me alone. Please, Ellie." But Ellie turned and fled, slamming the door shut behind her. Her heart raced as she leaned against the hallway wall, trying to catch her breath. Max found Ellie later that evening, sitting in her room with her knees drawn to her chest. Her stuffed rabbit lay discarded on the floor. He crouched in front of her, his voice low. "Ellie, did you go back in there?" he asked. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "She showed me things, Max. A garden. It was so pretty, but felt wrong." Max's face darkened. "What do you mean, wrong?" Ellie hesitated, her hands trembling. "It's like she wanted me to stay with her, forever." Max sat back, his jaw tightening. "We need to tell Mom and Dad. They'll believe us if we show them the mirror." "No!" Ellie cried, grabbing his arm. "You can't! What if Clara gets mad? What if she hurts them?" Max hesitated, the memory of the pale face in the mirror flashing through his mind. He couldn't deny that Ellie's fear felt justified. "Okay," he said finally. "We won't tell them yet, but we can't just let this go. We have to figure out how to stop her." That night, Ellie couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Clara's words echoing in her mind. "Don't leave me alone." A soft scratching sound pulled her from her thoughts. At first, she thought it was coming from the walls, but as it grew louder, she realized it was coming from the hallway. Ellie sat up, her heart pounding. The scratching was steady, rhythmic, like nails dragging across wood. She crept to her door and cracked it open, peering into the dimly lit hallway. The door to the locked room stood ajar. A faint glow seeped through the gap, flickering like candlelight. "Ellie," a voice whispered, soft and sweet, "come play." She froze, fear paralyzing her. The glow grew brighter, the voice more insistent. "Ellie, I'm waiting." Trembling, Ellie slammed her door shut and jumped back into bed, pulling the covers over her head. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, but the whispers didn't stop. They stayed with her all night, seeping into her dreams. The next morning, Max found Ellie pale and exhausted at the breakfast table. He leaned in close, his voice low. "What happened?" "She tried to get me to come back," Ellie whispered. She won't stop." Max clenched his fists. He knew they were running out of time. Clara wasn't just haunting the mirror, she was reaching out, pulling Ellie deeper into her grasp. And if they didn't act soon, Ellie might not come back. The following days brought a creeping unease to the Turner household. The nights grew colder, the house's shadows seemed darker, and a persistent tension hung in the air. Ellie's behavior became more withdrawn, her once cheerful demeanor replaced by quiet unease. But what unnerved Max the most were the scratches. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. One morning, Ellie woke up with a faint red line running across her forearm. She stared at it, puzzled, as she rubbed at the mark. It wasn't painful, but the sight of it left her feeling uneasy. "Did you scratch yourself in your sleep?" her mother asked, glancing at the mark when Ellie joined the family at breakfast. "I don't think so," Ellie mumbled. She hadn't wanted to mention the nightmare's twisted visions of Clara reaching for her, her pale hands clawing at the air. But the scratches didn't stop. Each morning, more appeared, thin, deliberate marks crisscrossing her arms and legs. By the third day, the scratches had deepened, angry and raw. "Ellie, this is serious," Sarah said, her tone sharp as she inspected her daughter's arms. "Are you hurting yourself?" "No!" Ellie cried, tears streaming down her face. "It's not me, it's her!" Her mother frowned. "Who, Ellie?" "Clara," Ellie whispered. Max wasn't faring much better. The nights brought him little sleep, haunted as he was by the memory of the mirror. One night, as he lay awake, he heard it, the scratching sound. It started faintly, like a distant echo, but grew louder, closer. He bolted upright, his heart pounding. The sound seemed to come from everywhere, the walls, the ceiling, the floor. But when he strained his ears, he realized the scratching was coming from the hallway. Steeling himself, Max crept out of bed and opened his door. The hallway was bathed in faint moonlight, and the sound grew sharper, more distinct. It was coming from the locked room. The door stood ajar, and Max could see the faint glow emanating from within. Swallowing his fear, he stepped closer, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet. He pushed the door open and froze. The mirror was alive with movement. Shadows danced across its surface, and Clara's face loomed large, her eyes hollow and black. Her hands pressed against the glass, her long nails scraping across its surface, creating the eerie sound that had drawn him. "Max," she whispered, her voice echoing in his mind, "it's your turn." Suddenly the mirror shattered outward, shards of glass flying toward him. Max stumbled back, throwing his arms up to shield his face, but when he opened his eyes, the mirror was whole again, its surface smooth and still. The next morning, Max told Ellie what he'd seen. They huddled in her room, the door locked, speaking in hushed tones. "She's trying to get to us," Max said, his voice tense. "She's not just stuck in the mirror anymore." Ellie nodded, her hands trembling as she clutched her stuffed rabbit. "She won't stop scratching me. It's like she's trying to pull me in." "We have to do something," Max said. "But what? We can't just destroy the mirror. I tried breaking it. It didn't work." Ellie hesitated, then pulled a piece of paper from her pocket. It was an article from the library, one they'd found about the Blackwood family. She pointed to a line at the bottom of the page. "They had a séance," she said. "Before Clara disappeared, they were trying to contact someone trapped in the mirror before her." Max frowned. "So, this has happened before?" Ellie nodded. "It's not just Clara, it's the mirror. It's been doing this for years." That evening, the scratching sounds grew louder, more insistent. They echoed through the walls, filling the house with an unbearable tension. Even Sarah and David noticed, though they dismissed it as mice in the walls. But Max and Ellie knew better. The sound wasn't random, it was deliberate, a rhythm that seemed to grow more frenzied as the night wore on. Ellie couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her body tense. When she finally drifted off, it was into another nightmare. In her dream, she stood before the mirror. Clara was there, her face twisted into a grotesque smile. Her hands reached out, clawing at the glass, and this time they broke through. Clara's arms stretched unnaturally long, her fingers wrapping around Ellie's wrist. "Stay with me," Clara hissed, her voice sharp and venomous. "Forever." Ellie woke with a scream, clutching her arms. The scratches were fresh, deeper now, and blood stained her pajama sleeves. The next morning, Ellie and Max knew they couldn't wait any longer. Whatever Clara or the mirror wanted, it was growing stronger. If they didn't act soon, Ellie feared she'd be lost forever. Max clenched his fists, determination burning in his eyes. We're gonna end this, he said, tonight. The Turner household was suffocating with unease as night fell. Max and Ellie had spent the day preparing, though neither fully understood what they were preparing for. They had read everything they could find on seances, spiritual bindings, and haunted objects, though most of it felt incomplete. Still, they were desperate. That evening, as the rest of the family went to bed, Max and Ellie crept into the locked room. Ellie clutched a flashlight while Max carried a makeshift kit, candles, matches, salt, and a few scraps of information they had pieced together from old books and articles. The air in the room felt heavier than before, almost stifling. The mirror stood at the far wall, its surface dark and foreboding. Ellie hesitated at the threshold, trembling. "She knows we're here," she whispered. Max nodded. "Good. We're gonna face her, together." The siblings set up their makeshift seance. They arranged the candles in a circle around the room, sprinkling a line of salt along the perimeter. Max read aloud from the fragmented ritual they had pieced together, his voice steady despite the fear creeping up his spine. "Spirits bound within this glass, show yourself," he called. "We summon you to speak your truth." The room fell silent. The candles flickered, and Ellie's flashlight began to dim. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a low whisper filled the room, echoing off the walls. "You shouldn't have come." Ellie gasped as the mirror's surface rippled, distorting her reflection. Clara's pale face emerged, her hollow eyes staring directly at Max. "You can't stop me," Clara hissed. "This is my home." "This isn't your home anymore," Max shouted, stepping forward. "You're trapped here, and you're hurting Ellie. Why? What do you want?" Clara's smile widened, grotesque and unnatural. "I want someone to stay with me," she said sweetly. Her voice turned venomous. "I've been alone for so long." "You don't have to take her," Max said, his voice firm despite the lump in his throat. "There has to be another way." Clara tilted her head, studying him. "Another way?" she echoed mockingly. "No, she's mine now." The room grew colder, the shadows on the walls deepening. The scratching sound returned, louder and more frantic, as if something were clawing its way toward them. "Max," Ellie whimpered, clutching his arm. "It's not working." "We'll make it work," Max said through gritted teeth. He picked up the salt and began throwing it toward the mirror, shouting, "Leave her alone! Let her go!" Clara shrieked, her reflection flickering in and out like a broken signal. The room trembled, the mirror's surface warping as if it were made of liquid. For a moment, Max thought they were winning. Then, the door to the room slammed shut, and the sound of a heavy lock clicked into place. Ellie screamed, running to the door and jiggling the handle. "It's locked!" she cried, tears streaming down her face. "Max, we're trapped!" Clara's laughter filled the room, echoing from every direction. Her image loomed larger in the mirror, her body twisting and contorting in impossible ways. "You can't leave," Clara said, her voice dripping with malice. "This is where you belong now." The candles extinguished all at once, plunging the room into darkness. The only light came from the mirror, its surface glowing with an eerie, pulsating light. Clara reached through the glass, her hands stretching outward, the tips of her fingers brushing the edges of the frame. Max grabbed Ellie and pulled her back. "Stay behind me," he shouted. Clara's hands gripped the edges of the mirror, and she began to crawl out. Her body was gaunt and skeletal, her hair hanging in limp strands around her face. She moved with unnatural speed, her movements jerky and wrong. "Ellie, the salt, spread the salt," Max yelled. Ellie scrambled to grab the remaining salt, her hands shaking. She threw it at Clara's emerging form, and the spirit let out an ear-piercing scream. The mirror crackled, its surface spiderwebbing with cracks, but Clara kept coming, her face twisted in rage. "You can't stop me," Clara shrieked. "You belong to me." Max grabbed Ellie's hand and pulled her toward the door. "We have to get out of here now." "I can't," Ellie sobbed, shaking the doorknob helplessly. "It's locked." Max looked around, his mind racing. His eyes landed on the hammer they'd brought as a backup plan. He grabbed it and swung at the mirror with all his strength. The glass shattered, shards flying everywhere, and Clara's scream turned into a deafening roar. But instead of dissipating, the fragments of the mirror hung in the air, floating like shards of ice. They began to swirl, forming a vortex in the center of the room. The pull was strong, tugging at Max and Ellie as they clung to each other. "Don't let go!" Max shouted, his grip on Ellie tightening. Clara's face appeared in the center of the vortex, her eyes burning with fury. "You can't escape me!" she howled. "This is my domain!" The room shook violently, and the siblings felt themselves being dragged closer to the vortex. Max grabbed a shard of the broken mirror and hurled it into the vortex with all his strength. The shard struck Clara's face, and for a moment, everything froze. Clara let out a final, soul-piercing scream, and the vortex collapsed in on itself, taking the shards, the mirror, and Clara with it. The room fell silent. The oppressive cold lifted, and the door unlocked with a soft click. Max and Ellie stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. They leaned against the wall, their bodies trembling. "Is it over?" Ellie asked, her voice barely audible. Max looked back at the now empty room. The mirror was gone, the walls bare and silent. "I think so," he said, though his voice was uncertain. But deep down, they both knew the house wasn't done with them yet. For a few days, the house was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The locked room at the end of the hall now stood open, empty, as if it had always been that way. Max and Ellie avoided it, their nerves too raw to face whatever lingering presence might still reside there. But peace was fleeting. The first signs of Clara's lingering influence came in the form of shadows. It started late one evening. Max sat at his desk, trying to focus on a math worksheet, when he noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. At first, he dismissed it as the flicker of a tree branch outside his window, but when he looked up, the shadow moved across his wall against the direction of the light. He froze, staring as the dark shape slithered along the wall like ink spilling in reverse. It was shapeless at first, but then it grew limbs, elongating until it resembled a thin, human-like figure. Max bolted out of his chair, his heart hammering in his chest. He flipped on the overhead light, and the shadow vanished. Shaking, he backed into the hallway, where he nearly collided with Ellie. "You saw it too," she whispered before he could speak. Max's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "In my room," Ellie said, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "The shadows, they were on the walls. They kept moving even when I turned on the light." A chill ran through Max. He grabbed her hand. "We need to find Mom and Dad." When they reached the living room, their parents were watching TV, blissfully unaware of the mounting horror around them. Max and Ellie tried to explain what they had seen, but their words tumbled over each other in panic, making little sense. "Shadows, moving walls," David said, frowning. "You kids need to stop scaring yourselves. This house is old. It creaks, it settles, it's not haunted." "But we're not making it up," Ellie cried, her voice breaking. "It's Clara! She's still here!" "That's enough, Ellie," Sarah said firmly, though there was a flicker of worry in her eyes. "You've both been through a lot lately. You need to calm down and get some rest." Max opened his mouth to argue, but Sarah's sharp glare silenced him. He grabbed Ellie's hand and led her back upstairs, muttering under his breath, "They'll believe us when it's too late." That night, the shadows returned in full force. Max woke to the sound of Ellie screaming. He bolted out of bed and ran to her room, his heart pounding. When he burst through the door, he found Ellie sitting in the corner, her knees drawn to her chest. Her room was bathed in an eerie, shifting darkness. The shadows on the walls moved like living creatures, writhing and clawing as if trying to break free. "She's here," Ellie whispered, her voice trembling. "She's in the shadows." Max grabbed her and pulled her out of the room, slamming the door behind them. But the shadows didn't stay confined. They began to seep through the cracks, slithering into the hallway. "Run!" Max shouted, dragging Ellie toward the stairs. They bolted downstairs, the shadows chasing them like a tide of ink. The living room was dark, the TV off, and their parents nowhere in sight. Max flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. "Mom, Dad," Ellie called, her voice breaking with panic. There was no answer. The shadows began pooling in the corners of the room, gathering mass. A shape emerged from the darkness, tall, thin, and grotesque. Its face was featureless, but its presence radiated malice. The air grew cold, and the sound of faint whispers filled the room, overlapping like a chorus of voices. "Max," Ellie whispered, clutching his arm. "It's her." The figure tilted its head, and the whispers grew louder. Max stepped in front of Ellie, his fists clenched. "Leave us alone," he shouted. "You're not welcome here." The figure didn't respond. Instead, it lunged toward them, its shadowy arms stretching unnaturally. Max grabbed a nearby lamp and swung it, but the figure dissipated into mist before reforming behind them. "This isn't working," Max yelled, pulling Ellie toward the kitchen. They needed to find something, anything that could help. In the kitchen, Max rummaged through drawers, tossing utensils and papers onto the floor. His hands finally landed on a box of matches. He grabbed it and lit one, holding it up as the shadows began to creep closer. The flame flickered, casting light into the encroaching darkness. The shadows recoiled slightly, but didn't retreat entirely. Max lit another match and threw it toward the figure. The flame hit the ground, and the shadows near it shrank back. "It doesn't like fire," Max said, realization dawning. He grabbed a candle from the counter and lit it, holding it high. "Ellie, get the others!" Ellie scrambled to gather candles from around the house, lighting each one and placing them in the corners of the room. As the warm glow filled the space, the shadows began to retreat, their movements frantic and disjointed. The tall figure hissed, its form wavering as if struggling to maintain shape. Its head snapped toward Max, and though it had no eyes, he could feel its hatred burning into him. "You can't banish me," the figure said, its voice layered and otherworldly. "This house is mine." Max stepped forward, holding the candle out like a weapon. "You don't scare me," he said, though his shaking hands betrayed him. "Leave us alone." The figure shrieked, its body dissolving into a flurry of dark tendrils. The shadows collapsed inward, retreating into the cracks of the walls. The house fell silent once more, the air heavy with an eerie stillness. Max and Ellie stood in the middle of the kitchen, their faces pale and their breaths ragged. They didn't know how long the reprieve would last, but one thing was certain. Clara, or whatever force controlled the shadows, wasn't gone. "She's getting stronger," Ellie whispered, her voice trembling. "What if we can't stop her?" Max set the candle down on the counter and placed a hand on her shoulder. "We will," he said firmly, though doubt gnawed at him. "We have to." But deep inside, both of them knew the worst was yet to come. The days following the shadow attack were a blur of tension and fear. Max and Ellie barely slept, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. Their parents dismissed their warnings, insisting the strange occurrences were their overactive imaginations. But Max and Ellie knew better. Clara, or the thing pretending to be Clara, was growing stronger. Ellie's scratches had worsened, turning into deep welts that bled during the night. Shadows moved even in daylight, slipping along the walls like black veins spreading through the house. The air was colder, heavier, and filled with an unrelenting sense of dread. "We can't keep running," Max said one night as they huddled in the living room, candles flickering around them. "We have to end this." "How?" Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible. "We don't even know what she is. What if she can't be stopped?" Max held up the journal they had found in the attic, a worn, leather-bound book filled with handwritten notes. It had belonged to one of the house's previous owners, a man named Edwin Blackwood. His words were fragmented and desperate, but one entry stood out. "The mirror must be the key. Clara is bound to it, her soul trapped by whatever cursed force claimed her. The ritual requires 3 elements: the key, an object of hers, and a sacrifice. Only then can the bond be severed. Only then can we be free." Max's voice was steady as he read the passage aloud, but Ellie's face paled. "Sacrifice," she repeated, her voice trembling. "What does that mean?" Max hesitated, the weight of the word hanging heavy between them. "I don't know," he admitted, "but it's the only clue we have. We need the key and something of hers. We already have the key." Ellie pulled the ornate key from her pocket, her fingers trembling as she handed it to Max. "But what about the other thing?" an object of hers. Max thought for a moment, then nodded toward the stuffed rabbit in Ellie's arms. That used to be Clara's. It must have been left here after she disappeared. Ellie clutched the rabbit tighter, her eyes welling with tears. I can't let her take Mr. Fluffy. It's not about her taking it, Max said gently. We're going to use it to stop her, to set her free. Ellie hesitated before nodding, reluctantly placing the rabbit on the table beside the key. What about the sacrifice? Max swallowed hard. I think it means someone has to stay in her place. Ellie's eyes widened in horror. You mean one of us? Max didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at the journal, his jaw tight. If it comes to that, I'll do it. That night, the siblings prepared for the ritual. They returned to the locked room, now bare, except for the faint outline on the wall where the mirror had hung. The air was suffocatingly cold, and every creak of the floorboards sent shivers down their spines. Max placed the key and the stuffed rabbit in the center of the room. He sprinkled a circle of salt around the objects and lit the candles they had brought. The flickering flames cast eerie shadows on the peeling wallpaper. Are you ready? Max asked, looking at Ellie. She nodded, though her hands trembled as she clutched his arm. What do we do? Max opened the journal and began to read the ritual's instructions aloud. His voice was steady, but the air seemed to grow heavier with every word he spoke. The shadows in the room deepened, crawling along the walls like living things. As Max finished the incantation, the objects in the circle began to tremble. The stuffed rabbit twitched, its button eyes gleaming in the candlelight. The key floated into the air, spinning slowly before dropping back to the ground. A guttural scream erupted from the walls, shaking the entire room. The shadows coalesced into a single figure, Clara. Her gaunt skeletal form emerged, her hollow eyes burning with hatred. You think you can stop me? She hissed, her voice echoing like a chorus of whispers. This is my home. You are nothing to me. Max stepped forward, his fists clenched. We're ending this, Clara. You've taken enough. Clara's face twisted into a grotesque smile. It's not me who will end. It's you. She lunged toward Max, her shadowy arms stretching out like claws. Ellie screamed, but Max held his ground, grabbing the stuffed rabbit and thrusting it toward Clara. This is yours, he shouted. Take it and leave us alone. Clara froze, her eyes locking onto the rabbit. Her face contorted with pain as she let out a blood-curdling scream. The shadows around her began to dissolve, retreating into the walls. But then the room shook violently, and Clara's voice boomed. A sacrifice is required. Ellie's eyes widened as she realized what was happening. No, Max, don't! Max turned to her, his expression calm but resolute. It's the only way, Ellie. I have to stay. Before Ellie could stop him, Max stepped into the circle. The shadows surged toward him, wrapping around his body like chains. Clara's face twisted into a cruel smile as she began to fade, her form dissolving into the darkness. Max! Ellie screamed, tears streaming down her face. Max looked at her, his face pale but determined. Take care of Mom and Dad, he said, and don't ever come back here. The shadows swallowed him whole, and the room fell silent. The candles snuffed out, plunging Ellie into darkness. When Ellie opened her eyes, she was lying on the hallway floor. The locked room was gone, just a blank wall where the door had once been. She called out for Max, but only silence answered her. Her parents found her hours later, huddled on the floor, clutching the stuffed rabbit. She told them everything, but they dismissed it as a nightmare. But Ellie knew the truth. Max had sacrificed himself to save her, and now he was trapped in Clara's place. And every night, as she drifted to sleep, she thought she could hear his voice whispering through the walls. Don't forget me. The Turner family sold the house 6 months later. Sarah and David decided the move was too much for the family, especially after Ellie's apparent breakdown and Max's sudden disappearance. The official story was that Max had run away, though Ellie knew the truth. She carried it with her like a heavy stone, a secret she could never share. The house sat empty for years after they left, its cracked windows and peeling paint reflecting its abandonment. Locals avoided it, whispering rumors about the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. The stories grew with each retelling, about a boy who vanished into thin air, about the haunted mirror, and about the shadowy figure that still prowled its halls. But the house was never truly empty. Years later, Ellie returned to Ravenswood. She was an adult now, her face hardened by time and grief. She had spent years researching haunted houses, occult practices, and the supernatural. No matter where life took her, she couldn't escape the memory of Max and the role she had played in his fate. She had avoided Ravenswood for as long as she could. But now, standing at the edge of the overgrown driveway, the towering Victorian house loomed before her once more. Its broken shutters and crumbling facade seemed even more menacing in the twilight. Ellie's hands trembled as she clutched a satchel filled with supplies, candles, salt, and a book of exorcisms she had painstakingly translated. She wasn't here for closure. She was here to get Max back. The house welcomed her with silence. Dust hung heavy in the air, and the faint scent of mildew tickled her nose. Every step she took echoed eerily, her footsteps the only sound in the empty halls. But the house wasn't truly silent. It whispered to her, faint murmurs she couldn't quite understand, drawing her deeper into its heart. Ellie found her way to the upstairs hallway, stopping at the blank wall where the locked room had once been. Her heart pounded as she reached out to touch the wall, half expecting it to be solid. But her hand passed through the air, and the door appeared faded, ethereal, but undeniably there. She stepped inside. The room was just as she remembered it, though now it felt colder, darker. The mirror was gone, but the sense of something watching her remained. She set up her supplies quickly, placing candles in a circle and sprinkling salt along the edges. Her hands trembled as she opened the book and began to chant. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with the weight of unseen eyes. Shadows danced along the walls, creeping closer to the circle of light cast by the candles. Ellie's voice wavered but didn't stop. She had spent years preparing for this moment. She wouldn't fail now. "Max," she called, her voice breaking. "If you can hear me, come back. I'm here to bring you home." The shadows froze. For a moment there was silence. Then a voice echoed through the room, soft and trembling. "Ellie?" Her heart leapt. "Max, I'm here!" Tears streamed down her face as she clutched the book tighter. "I'm gonna get you out." The shadows swirled, coalescing into a shape, a figure tall and thin, with a face that was almost familiar. But Max's eyes were hollow, his body translucent and wrapped in dark tendrils. "You shouldn't have come," Max said, his voice layered with another's, a voice colder, darker. "She won't let me go." "Who?" Ellie asked, her voice shaking. As if in response, the shadows erupted, filling the room with an oppressive darkness. The air turned icy, and Clara's voice rang out, sharp and cruel. "You broke the rules," she hissed. "You left me alone." Ellie's candles flickered wildly, the flames struggling to stay lit. She stood her ground, holding out the book. "You don't belong here anymore, Clara. I'm sending you back." Clara's laughter filled the room, low and menacing. "You think you can save him? He's already mine." Max's form trembled, his eyes widening as he turned toward Ellie. "Leave, Ellie. You can't stop her." "No," Ellie shouted, her voice fierce. "I'm not leaving you behind again." She threw a handful of salt into the air, the grains sparkling like tiny stars as they hit the darkness. Clara's scream echoed through the room, a sound of pure rage. The shadows recoiled, but Clara's form began to emerge, a twisted, grotesque figure with hollow eyes and clawed hands. Ellie began the final incantation, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. The room shook violently, the shadows writhing like wounded animals. Clara lunged toward Ellie, but the salt and candles held her back, forming a barrier she couldn't cross. "Max!" Ellie cried. "Fighter, I need you to come back." Max's form wavered, his face contorted in pain. The tendrils wrapped around him tightened, pulling him toward Clara, but Ellie's voice seemed to reach him. His hand stretched out toward her, and for a brief moment their fingers touched. "Ellie," he whispered, "thank you." With a final desperate chant, Ellie threw the last of the salt into the air. The room erupted in light, blinding and pure. Clara let out a final soul-piercing scream as her form shattered into nothingness. The shadows vanished, retreating into the walls like smoke dissipating into the wind. And then silence. When Ellie opened her eyes, the room was empty. The oppressive cold was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt almost peaceful. She called out for Max, but there was no answer. Tears streamed down her face as she sank to the floor, clutching the empty space where her brother had stood. She had done everything she could, but it hadn't been enough. As she turned to leave, she noticed something on the floor, a single shard of the mirror. She picked it up and gasped. In its reflection, she saw Max, smiling at her. "Thank you, Ellie," he said softly. "I'm free now." The shard went dark, and Ellie clutched it to her chest, her heart aching. She left the house that night, knowing she would never return. But as she walked away, she felt a sense of peace for the first time in years. Max was gone, but he was finally free, and the forgotten room, at long last, was silent.